أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Today we will discuss chapter 17 from The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times by René Guénon, which is entitled The Solidification of the World. This is a particularly important chapter. It has a certain centrality in terms of the rest of the book. We still haven't reached quite halfway, but we're almost there. When we get to about page 140, we'll be about halfway. This is page 113 is where chapter 17 begins, but this concept of the solidification of the world plays an important role in the subsequent chapters. And the last several chapters since about chapter 13 on have been devoted to the elaboration of the ramifications of Cartesian dualism, rationalism, and its concomitants, namely mechanism and materialism. In chapter 15, there was a discussion of the illusion of ordinary life, and this illusion is intimately connected with materialism and what Guénon calls factual materialism, or the permeation throughout society and into people's thought worlds of this notion of materialism. Then there was a lengthy digression in chapter 16 on the degeneration of coinage, which in which I think that Guénon missed the mark to some extent, and I've already spoken about this, and now he returns to the theme of materialism and speaks about solidification. And we will start at the beginning, which is on chapter 1, which is on page 113. But for just one moment, I would like you to jump forward to page 115. And 3 lines down, it says, instead of speaking as heretofore of materialization, it would be possible to use the word solidification in a sense that is fundamentally the same, and in a manner perhaps more precise and perhaps even more realistic, he says. So when he speaks of solidification, he is in effect talking about materialization, but with a slightly different nuance. And I'm going to try and explain and bring out that nuance now. So going back to page 113, where the solidification of the world, chapter 17, begins, he says, let us now return. So he recognizes that this whole discussion of coinage has been a bit slightly off of the original flow that he'd established back in chapter 13. And he's saying, let us now return to the explanation of how a world conforming as far as possible to the materialistic conception has been effectively realized in the modern period. All right. So, in effect, he wants to explain in more detail now exactly how materialism has spread. If this is to be understood, it must be remembered above all that, as has been often pointed out, the human order and the cosmic order are not in reality separated, as they are nowadays all too readily imagined to be. They are, on the contrary, closely bound together in such a way that each continuously reacts on the other, so that there is always a correspondence between their respective states. This again is the idea of as above, so below, which you find in Hermes. In other words, that there is a connection between human affairs and the cosmic cycle. In other words, the cosmic order. He says this correspondence is essentially implied in the whole doctrine of cycles. Without it, the traditional data with which the said doctrine is concerned would be almost entirely unintelligible. The relationship existing between certain critical phases of human history and certain cataclysms that occur according to a known astronomical periodicity affords perhaps the most striking example. But it is obvious that this is only an extreme case of correspondences of this kind. So he is alluding to this ancient knowledge of periodic cataclysms that have a certain astronomical periodicity, and they are very much couched in certain myths, mythological or mythopoetic language. And he doesn't much elaborate on it much. He doesn't elaborate on it much at all after that. He sort of mentions it in passing. He does come back to this theme somewhat, I think, in... just to be certain, it's chapter 19 on the limits of history and geography. But for the moment, I'll just say that much of this is connected with the doctrine of the precession of the equinoxes. If you might hand me the globe, please. Very well, thank you very much. So I have this visual aid. This is a globe. Very nice. There are no political markings on it, as it should be. And you notice that this globe is tilted. In other words, the axis, if I'll use my pencil, is here. And we can extend it from the bottom as well. So this is an axis. And if you were to measure this relative to the vertical, this would be the vertical, it's tilted, it's about 23 degrees. And so the Earth, let's get this right, and then here's Africa, revolves from west to east, which is why the sun appears to rise in the east. It revolves this way. Now, as the Earth is revolving on its axis, if you imagine my fist is the sun, and this obviously is not to scale, it's also going around the sun. And while it does that, because the distribution of mass on the surface of the Earth is not uniform, and as it rotates, it also bulges slightly, it will wobble. So this wobble is called the precession of the equinoxes, and as it rotates and it goes around the sun, it's also wobbling a bit, but very, very slowly. And as it wobbles, over a period of 26,000 years, it will trace out a cone in the sky up here and a cone down. It's like the conic section. It's really interesting. Two cones connected. And that will trace out a little circle. Now, the fact is it's not a perfectly straight because it also zigzags. And that is called nutation. And all of these things are very well known to modern scientists. But the fact is that these things were also known to the ancients. And there were periodic destructions and cataclysms that are connected with this precession of the equinoxes. Moreover, there is also this ancient doctrine that the world was not always tilted, and it was like this. It was straight up relative to the vertical of its, and it was rotating like this. Now, if that were the case, if that were indeed the case, then there would be no seasons, because the phenomenon of seasons is due to the tilt. And this is quite possible. So if that was the case, then there wouldn't have been any seasons. It would have been perpetual spring. It's quite likely that the orbit of the Earth around the sun was maybe exactly 360 degrees, which would explain why the ancient Babylonians, who inherited this idea from the Sumerians, speak of 360 degrees in a circle. And it would not be too far-fetched also to think that the atmospheric pressure may indeed have been different, in which case then animals would have to have been larger. They would have had bigger muscles. They would have more skeletal structure. Lots of things would have been different if the atmospheric pressure was different. Giants may well have roamed the Earth, as some ancient texts say. And there is a very interesting book on ancient cataclysms. So part of what I'm trying to do in these lectures on Genon is to give you some other sources, because Genon speaks in very, very general terms, and he doesn't really care if you understand or not. And I'm just trying to share with you my experiences, because I've been reading this book for years and years and thinking about these things for, gosh, I don't know, maybe 25 years now. And so there is a book which I came across that resonated with me in terms of what I read in Genon and other traditional authors. And this book is entitled Cataclysm, Compelling Evidence of a Cosmic Catastrophe in 9500 BC. Now, we don't have time to really go over all this, so the lights are shining on this and giving some glare, so I'll put it at an angle here so you can see it. So we don't really have time to go into all this, but there's a huge amount of footnoting and evidence here regarding this whole question of cosmic catastrophes. Really, probably the pioneer in this area was a Russian by the name of Immanuel Velikovsky, who wrote a book called Worlds in Collision and subsequently authored other works. His books are easily found. They circulate quite widely on the used book market, and so I refer you to that. There's also a really interesting text called Hamlet's Mill, a very difficult book, like Genon's, which also looks at this. The popularization in this field was brought about by a man named Graham Hancock. Now many people and Gen Z types have even heard of him because he had some sort of a series that aired on the famous or the infamous Netflix. But he wrote a book a long time ago called Fingerprints of the Gods, which sort of popularized many of these ideas. Anyhow, enough said about that. So Genon is not really concerned here with this notion of cataclysms. He is talking rather about the solidification of the world, the in the sense of cyclical conditions, making it harder and harder for people to understand, on the one hand, the supramundane level, and at the same time a kind of hardening of the ambiance, if that's the right word. I don't think it is, but the hardening of the world, and a kind of, shall we say, an increasing opacity, a reciprocal opacity between the receptivity on the one hand of human beings to the supermundane order, as well as its accessibility as well, due to the rapidly advancing cycle. So he says, that being the case, it is quite natural that in the course of cyclical development, both the cosmic manifestation as a whole and also human mentality, which is of course necessarily included therein, together follow the same descending course, the nature of which has already been specified as consisting in a gradual movement away from the principle, and thus away from the primal spirituality inherent in the essential pole of manifestation. So it is very much like the propagation of a beam of light. In other words, manifestation, the more that we move away from the principle with a capital P, both in allegorically speaking, in a spatial and temporal sense, then the more remote human beings, as well as the entire created order, so to speak, become from the principle. And there is therefore a concomitant or corresponding increase in the opacity or receptivity of human beings to supramundane realities, as well as, from the other side, reciprocally speaking, their accessibility as well becoming somewhat obscured. In other words, that those gates are not as easy as they were in former times to be traversed or entered into, or passed through, excuse me. And so he speaks of this as a kind of progressive materialization of the cosmic environment. And he says, it is only when this materialization has reached a certain stage, by now already very marked, that the materialistic conception can appear in man as its correlative, together with the general attitude that corresponds with it in practice, and fits in as explained with the picture of ordinary life. So this term of solidification is this further nuance that he's adding to this process of materialization, inasmuch as this emergence of materialism is itself inextricably linked with the cosmic conditions or cyclical realities. In other words, this is about 2/3 of the way down, page 114, it could be said that materialization exists as a tendency, but that materiality, which would be the complete fulfillment of that tendency, is an unrealizable condition. So materialization exists, but you will never get complete materiality, because despite the thoroughly diminished capacities of human beings in terms of their receptivity to the supermundane order, it nevertheless does not cease to exist. It is there. Whether people want to pass through the gates, as I said, which might be somewhat more difficult now, or not, is another matter. So in that sense, materiality is never fully realized. There's only a progressive materialization which sort of asymptotically approaches, so as it were, full materiality. One consequence of this, among others, is that the mechanical laws theoretically formulated by modern science are never susceptible to an exact and rigorous application to the conditions of experience, wherein there always remain elements that are entirely beyond their grasp, even in the phase in which the part played by such elements is in a sense reduced to a minimum. So it is always the case. So it is always a case of approximation, and during this phase, leaving out of account cases that will in such times be exceptional, approximation may suffice for immediate practical needs. So a true scientia is not engineering. So he's saying that even with the advance of modern science and technology, that science is not really a true science because, well, things are not purely matter. They have the character of approximations. And so, even though this thing is pretty exact, this is a slide rule. A lot of people don't use this anymore. But much of the modern world was designed using this. A lot of the infrastructure and bridges and these things in the U.S. were designed using calculations on this. And you can basically, 3 significant figures, 4 significant figures is more than enough for modern engineering purposes. And even if you have something like a calculator, HP35 calculator, or even computers, apps, different things, the calculation of sine, cosine, and so forth by various angles is also actually done as an approximation within the circuitry. They're basically, they add up a finite number of terms from a Taylor series expansion of sine or cosine or what have you. And these things are well known to the science geeks out there. So the point is, it's all an approximation. Now that approximation may be good enough to give us all of this fancy schmancy technology, including what we're using now, but it is not really a true scientia. And again, all of this is possible because of the cyclical conditions. Gainon later says in other places that this kind of a techno world, a world which is completely and thoroughly engineered in terms of mass production, was just not even possible in previous ages within the Kali Yuga, because materialization or solidification had not proceeded that far, and that people of those former times would not have even thought in this way. That's his view. That's his view. I think there's something to be said for it. Whether you're entirely convinced or not is something for you to think about and conclude about. So finally, we get to page 115, where he now makes the point that, well, instead of speaking heretofore of materialization, it would be possible to use the word solidification in a sense that it is fundamentally the same, and in a manner perhaps more precise and perhaps even more realistic. For solid bodies, owing to their density and their impenetrability, do in fact give the illusion of materiality more strongly than does anything else. Here I'm struck by this observation because if you look in pre-modern times, in Aristotle and the physics of Aristotle, which was inherited by let's say Islamic civilization, there really is no notion of force in the modern sense, and there is no notion of mass. We have to wait for Newton to come up with this idea of mass. And mass really is the measure, according to modern physics, of the amount of stuff or the matter that you have. And I think it's an interesting point that we had to wait until a guy like Newton to come along. And it's a fundamentally different understanding of the world, of the natural order that we have in Newton, as opposed to pre-Newton. It's a complete change. Notions of force, of mass, of motion, completely transformed.
What did they think things were made up of if they didn't believe in modern notion of mass?
There wasn't any measure of it. They spoke of weight,
Uh-huh.
but they didn't have the notion of weight as a force. It was just wazn in Arabic. But they didn't have this modern notion of mass. There's a distinction between mass and weight. Weight is a force. It's the force exerted by a given mass in a particular gravitational field. So strictly speaking, people stand up and they weigh themselves and they say, oh, well, I weigh 100 kilograms, for example. That's not really correct. According to the conventions of modern physics, kilogram is a unit of mass. So if you want to know how much you weigh, then you have to multiply that by the acceleration of gravity, which is 9.8 meters per second every second. So that would mean that you weigh 980 newtons if you're 100 kilograms. And if
when you actually move?
No, that's what you weigh. And
Oh,
if
wow.
you were to be on the moon, it would be different. There's a different
I see.
acceleration of gravity on the moon. So the acceleration of gravity is this: like, if I don't want to drop this pencil, this is a very good pencil. If I drop this pencil, for example, I don't want to risk bending the nib. So this would fall. Again, it's an approximation because you neglect air resistance. For something like this, you can neglect air resistance. So these kind of notions were not there. And they would say that, the things that fall, they fall because they seek their natural place. There was this doctrine of the natural place. Mm-hmm. And then smoke, for example, rises because it's from fire. And then you have what we today would call projectile motion, was called al-harakatul qasriya in Arabic, or forced motion. In other words, you throw a ball or a spear or whatever. So you impart to it motion. They didn't have this notion of imparting to it some sort of force. It means compelled motion.
So it was all motion for them.
It's a compelled motion. You are compelling it, and the compulsion extends only so far before it hits the ground again and falls. But they didn't have this notion. All right, well, projectile motion and ballistics say, oh, well, I've fired this thing, I've thrown this projectile, it was launched at this angle. It's at shoulder height, so I have to take into account the height above the earth, the surface, the zero where you measure it from. And then it's projected a certain way. Its horizontal component will be whatever its velocity is times the cosine of theta as the horizontal component. Then you take the vertical component, would be sine theta. And they develop all of this stuff. That wasn't there among the ancients. All of this is due to Newton. And that was made possible by Descartes. And before that, by Galileo. Anyhow. Where were we? So further down on page 115, he says that solidification is absolutely fundamental for why modern science works. He says, now the actual occurrence of solidification, in other words, the peculiarity of the cyclical conditions right now, which he calls solidification in this context, is precisely the true reason why modern science succeeds. Certainly not in its theories, which remain as false as before, and in any case change all the time, but in its practical applications. Again, we would, in more modern language, say technology. In other periods when solidification was not yet so marked, as I already said, not only could man never have dreamed of industry, here we might read technology as we know it today, but any such industry would actually have been completely impossible in its entirety, as would the ordinary life in which industry plays so great a part. There was no mass production. There were no mass factories. Things were handmade. They might have been done on a large scale, but everything was handmade. Everything. I mean, if you imagine. Mm-hmm. It's a staggering thing to contemplate for modern people. But everything had to be made by hand. Human labor. At the bottom of 115, in order to reach the stage that has been described, man must have lost the use of the faculties which in normal times allowed him to pass beyond the bounds of the sensible world. Now here he is addressing this progressive increase in the opacity of the human being, what I also call the obduracy of the individual, factual materialism, what corresponds to the long-range vacuity of the individual in Jacques Ellul. This opacity, this lack of receptivity to spiritual influences, to influences of a supermundane order, is also a characteristic of solidification, in other words, of the peculiar cyclical conditions in which modern man finds himself. And again, this is a consequence of moving away progressively from the principle. Now, according to Genon, this has produced considerable modifications. We're on top of 116 now, in his psychophysiological constitution. Certainly, the physiological constitution of human beings has been affected. According to the Hebrew Bible, human beings live far longer. I think they say Methuselah lived 950 years. There has been a progressive diminution. I mean, if you just look around, if you imagine, most of us spend all our time sitting down in the modern world. I mean, do you think that anybody alive today could compare to, let's say, a Viking? The Vikings would have been absolutely shredded. Or ripped, or however they say it. In other words, they would have been extraordinary specimens of physical development in stark contrast to people today. You know, could a modern Let's take a modern U.S. Marine recruit today, and let's take away all his automatic weapons and all the other fancy schmancy gear. And if we handed him a Viking broadsword and a shield, or even decked him out as a warrior from ancient Babylon or ancient Persia, would he be able to hold his own? Could he move around with a sword that heavy? How long would he be able to swing it? The whole food supply has been damaged. We have constant electromagnetic poisoning in our environment. The human physiological health has been badly, badly affected by these direct results of the cyclical conditions, this technology. The food is also contaminated, sedentary lifestyle, etc., etc. Now, there is a concomitant or a correspondent diminution in spiritual faculties as well, Genon would say. In the spiritual faculties, well, not just the physical constitution, but the spiritual faculties as well. Having said that, however, he's also of the view that it is nonetheless true that there can never anywhere be an absolute separation between orders of existence, that, however far this opacity may have gone, it's still accessible if you try hard enough. I take him to be saying. Now he wants to address a question. He says, it might, however, legitimately be asked. He's raising a question. How so complete and so general an atrophy of certain faculties has actually come about? In order that it might take place, man had first of all to be induced to turn all his attention exclusively to sensible things. The work of deviation had necessarily to begin in this way, that work which could be said to consist in the manufacturing of the present world. So it's like, in terms of political attitudes, the manufacturing of consent, this famous phrase by Chomsky. But there has been a similar, I would say, manufacturing of opacity, or an engineering of ghafla, heedlessness, I would say. Ghafla is the Arabic word, a Quranic term. And this is a kind of a diabolical and occult engineering, far more advanced than the social engineering of policy planners, I would say. There has been a corruption of education. Various ideas have been unleashed in the realm of education and forced on people, and they're all now reaching quite shocking levels in modern schools and so forth. But there is a vast sort of complex of this. The media is part of it. It constantly reinforces this. And there are also a billion, literally, distractions in the world. The World Wide Web has multiplied these distractions probably a billionfold than what they were before. So besides the obsession of most people in the modern world today, especially non-Muslims, practicing Muslims don't do these things, but the biggest drug in the modern world is alcohol, in terms of a substance taken into the body. Mm-hmm. But they don't talk about it because basically everybody other than practicing Muslims is deeply involved in it. And then there's all those cocaine and heroin and God knows, all these very designer drugs and so forth, and all sorts of diversions and so forth that divert you from the contemplation of the true purpose of human life. So all of this is very, very sinister. So what was he saying? In order that it might take place, man had first of all to be induced to turn all his attention exclusively to sensible things. The work of deviation had necessarily to begin in this way, that work which could be said to consist in the manufacturing of the present world. And it clearly could not succeed in its turn except precisely at this phase of the cycle and by using in diabolical mode, so Genon also thinks it's satanic, the existing conditions of the environment itself. So much for this matter, which need not be further insisted on for the moment. Nevertheless, the solemn silliness of certain declamations dear to scientific or rather scientistic popularizers can scarcely be too much admired when they are pleased to assert on all occasions that modern science ceaselessly pushes back the boundaries of the known world, which is in fact the exact opposite of the truth. Now he elaborates on this in chapter 19. Never have these boundaries been so close as they are in the conceptions admitted by this profane self-styled science. Never have either the world or man been so shrunken to the point of their being reduced to mere corporeal entities, deprived by a hypothesis of the smallest possibility of communication with any other order of reality. So this is the extent to which solidification has proceeded as a direct consequence of the cyclical conditions which prevail now at this point in the Kali Yuga. However, the human being is not passive in this regard, is not a mere spectator, and this is what he elaborates upon next. There is also yet another aspect of the question, both reciprocal and complementary to the aspect considered hitherto. Man is not restricted at any stage to the passive role of a mere spectator, who must confine himself to forming an idea more or less true or more or less false of what is happening around him. On the contrary, he is himself one of the factors that intervene actively in the modification of the world he lives in. And it must be added that he is even a particularly important factor by reason of the characteristically central position that man occupies in the world. So the mention of this human intervention does not imply that the artificial modifications to which industry subjects the terrestrial environment are alone in view, and in any case they are too obvious to be worth spending time on. They are certainly something to be taken into account, but they are not everything. And the matter now particularly to be considered in relation to the point of view of the present discussion is something quite different, and is not willed by man. What he means is that with the very spread of the materialistic worldview, with the very spread of the notion of solidification, it reinforces itself. And he's kind of repeating himself. He's said this before in the section on, or the chapter on materialism, which was chapter 15, materialism and mechanism. He's in effect restating it here with a slightly different nuance, connecting it to the cyclical conditions and saying that, well, the human beings themselves participate in their own being misguided, as it were. So he says here on page 117, the truth is that the materialistic conception, once it has been formed and spread abroad means spread around here, in one way or another, can only serve to further reinforce the very solidification of the world that in the first place made it possible. So it's kind of a feedback loop. And all the consequences directly or indirectly derived from the conception, including the current notion of ordinary life, tend only toward the same end, for the general reactions of the cosmic environment do actually change according to the attitude adopted by man toward it. So to put this in maybe more comprehensible terms, to put this in more comprehensible terms, Guénon, first of all, is writing in French, and this is a translation. And I don't know, I think it's just maybe the way that people write in French. It doesn't really, even in translation, come out in the most idiomatic way, I suppose, or in the most understandable way. And it may also be just the way that Guénon wrote is these very long sentences. So I would simply say that what he is the point he's trying to make here is that the more vigorously a lie is spread, right? The more vigorously a lie is spread, the more it takes on the character of a universally acknowledged truth. Albeit its entirety, it's a lie, it's false, but the more vigorously it's spread and the more often it's repeated, it takes on the character of a universally acknowledged truth because people assent to it, and then it becomes called common knowledge. So I would say that that's really what he's trying to say here. And when that happens, there is also a reaction, so to speak. So you've cut yourself off. You've sort of prejudiced yourself against any kind of acknowledgement that there can be any intrusion, so forth, into this, what you think is a closed system, from a spiritual order or from the supramundane order. And then basically that world becomes inaccessible to you because you're just not open to it. Your heart isn't open to it. You're not even going to consider it. You don't even want to listen. And this is, Genon says, not a more or less picturesque manner of speaking. In other words, that those who have a profane materialistic point of view, they become inaccessible. They can't access that world. Then this is not just a metaphor, he says. It's not a picturesque manner of speaking, as some people might be tempted to think, he says, but is the simple and direct statement of fact, just as it is a fact that animals flee spontaneously and instinctively from the presence of anyone who evinces a hostile attitude towards them. That is why there are some things that can never be grasped by men of learning who are materialists or positivists, and this naturally further confirms their belief in the validity of their conceptions by seeming to afford a sort of negative proof of them, whereas it is really neither more nor less than a direct effect of the conceptions themselves. So, these aspects of reality, Genon says, of the truly real, in effect conceal themselves from anyone who looks upon them from a purely profane viewpoint or materialistic viewpoint. The Quran also says this. That in effect God places a seal upon them. It says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in Surah Al-Baqarah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Khatam Allahu ala qulubihim. Khatam Allahu ala qulubihim wa ala sam'ihim wa ala... I think I'm getting it wrong. Let's get it right. It should be ayah... No, I had it right. Ayah 7. ختم الله على قلوبهم وعلى سمعهم وعلى أبصارهم غشاوة. Allah has placed a seal upon their hearts and upon their hearing, and upon their vision is a covering. So, and it's interesting actually, now that I think about it, that since this is in Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter of the Quran talks about the people who are not closed off, who believe. It says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alif, Lam, Mim. This is also very interesting. These mysterious letters, Alif, Lam, and Mim, that are symbolic and they signify various aspects of the metaphysical order. It says, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. That indeed is the book in which there is no doubt and there is a guidance for those who believe. الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ. Those who believe in the unseen. Those who believe in a realm which is beyond. They're merely sensible. And then, we can skip forward a bit and a few verses, and it says that Allah has placed a seal upon their hearts and upon their hearing, and upon their vision is a covering. So, so this is the solidification of the world. So these people are cut off from the domain that they're cut off because of their profane point of view. And because of that limitation, on page 118, because of that limitation, Genon says, man becomes incapable of getting out of the sensible world. He becomes kind of a prisoner because of what has just been called its counterpart. In other words, the response then, that realm in effect sort of conceals itself from people because they aren't receptive. He loses, in addition, all chance of becoming aware of a manifest intervention of suprasensible elements in the sensible world itself. So for him, that world has become to the greatest possible extent completely closed, for it has become ever more solid as it has become more isolated from every other order of reality, even from those orders that are nearest to it and simply constitute separate modalities of one and the same individual domain. And so if you are trapped, if you are a prisoner of that self-imposed sort of closed world and closed system, then you think that that is the nature of life. That is for you ordinary life. That is what is real. And you think then that this is a very stable world and you can roll on like this without any trouble forever. That is the situation of modern man. Again, however, Guénon says that no matter how far the solidification of the world may actually proceed, and I'm just sort of paraphrasing in more simple language, that there are limits beyond which the solidification cannot continue, it cannot go. Because arrival at its extreme endpoint would be incomparable with any real existence, even of the lowest degree, and moreover, the further solidification goes, the more precarious it becomes. So that this world, as it moves more and more away from the principle through the passage of time and through the subsequent and continuing processes of necrosis and degeneration, it will reach a point of complete and total deliquescence or dissolution. And that is where things are going. He brings up, just as he closes the chapter, just before he closes the chapter, the idea of fissures in the wall. And I think he returns to this notion later. K enables sphere to cube. Isn't there a chapter called Cracks in the Wall? So he will come back to this several chapters later, namely in chapter 25 and 24, as he deals with dissolution, and then he talks about fissures in the Great Wall, and then shamanism, sorcery. So a lot of this has to do with the creeping in and sort of occult phenomenon. Some people have even identified the UFO phenomenon with some aspects, actually, some instances of the so-called UFO phenomenon of actually being demonic activity, specifically so-called alien abductions and so forth. I think other aspects of the UFO phenomenon are actually genuine in the sense, I'm not saying that I think that there's extraterrestrial life, but I think that these are actual advanced sort of government black ops, flying machines, aircraft, spacecraft, whatever you want to call them, that the government is working on and has put together this whole insane idea, I think, of alien visitations and so forth. But that's my view. You don't have to agree. But there are people who are also traditionalist writers, like, isn't it Charles Upton, who is of that view in his book Vectors of the Counter-Initiation, and also his book on the Antichrist, the Dajjal. He deals with these fissures. So I'm not going to say anything further about this until Guénon comes back to it around chapter 25. He's simply saying that this solidification is a further nuance of materialism and materialization, and this solidification is a direct consequence of the cyclical conditions of moving away spatially, so to speak, and also with the passage of time, temporally speaking, from the principle that things become more and more far away and darker and more solidified, and ultimately will lead toward a dissolution. And I think I'm just going to stop there, and then we'll move to chapter 18, Scientific Mythology and Popularization, in the next lecture. Thank you very much for watching.